Hey there, listeners. This is actually the first episode we ever recorded and also the first episode I ever hosted, so it is a lot more rough than the ones that we've done or the ones that you've heard earlier, but we do think that is actually fun to listen to, and we hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Welcome back to another episode of Modern Retrospect. I'm Joseph.
And I'm Yovan, and this week we're going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite games, and one of the best games in the survivor horror genre, and one of the best games in general.
And it is none other than Resident Evil 4.
Resident Evil 4.
It was originally released in the GameCube, or on the GameCube, in 2005, even though it began development for PlayStation 2 in 1999. There were actually 4 proposed versions that were discarded, but the first attempt was actually directed by Hideki Kamiya, after producer Shinji Mikami. In a departure from the fixed camera angles and the slower elements of survival horror gameplay that were known to be from previous installments, the team decided to start focusing on a more dynamic shooting action way of playing.
And actually, Hideki Kamiya, his version actually ended up turning into Devil May Cry. So that's
Really?
pretty interesting. Yeah, Shinji Mikami thought that it was too different from Resident Evil, but the game was actually extremely fun. So instead of discarding the whole thing, they ended up turning the game into Devil May Cry, another great Capcom series.
Yeah, as I recall, there was a talk about basically there was too much of a coolness factor that they ended up having that he didn't want to be too evident in Resident Evil. And so that's actually what became of Devil May Cry, which when you think about it, they're drastically different games aside from maybe the camera angles in the first game.
Well, the irony that is in the later installments, Leon is running away from multiple explosions. So, I mean, it almost seems like Resident Evil became more, kind of ridiculous than Devil May Cry itself at some point. So,
I mean, I definitely say, being one to actually play Resident Evil 4 that you actually solely recommended for me to do, the Wii version specifically, I do have to say it definitely was cooler than what I thought it was going for. He was kind of like an action hero making his way through a horror movie, is what I'd almost call it. But despite that, actually, the development of Resident Evil 4 actually had a lot of traveling involved. They actually spent actually 11 days in the United Kingdom in Spain, photographing objects like statues, bricks, and pavements and everything to use in textures, which was something actually you can tell is actually the game Resident Evil 4 is very detail oriented in a lot of ways. Which surprised me for being such an older game too.
Yeah, and actually, when I first played the game, I mean, it's compared to modern games now, it's pretty, not detailed at all. I guess compared to 4K and HDR and all that stuff. But back in the day, you could really tell. I mean, the bricks and the floor with the leaves and the textures really stood out at the time. And after reading that they did go to the United Kingdom and Spain to kind of photograph, I could really see, when you play the game with that knowledge in mind, you could tell where some of those photographs really contributed to the game.
Oh, well, I have a question for you though. So since you actually were the one to recommend me this game and you were like really heavy about me playing this game, so much so that you let me borrow the disc that you had from the Wii version, and I pulled out my Wii U and started playing it, why do you think it was, like, for you at least, one of the biggest games you wanted me to play?
Well, this is one of those kind of gaming landmarks. Like, one of those Ocarina of Times, Final Fantasy VII, Mario 64 kind of games, right? It's almost like a passage of, rites of passage, or, you I do feel that is every gamer should at least try this game, because most of the modern games that we play, as Gears of War, 3D shooters in general. I mean, they're all in some ways, in my opinion, influenced by Resident Evil 4. That behind the camera view third person shooter. I mean, that was huge, right? That was revolutionary. Games at the time were still trying to figure out how to work in 3D with camera controls and shooting mechanics. I mean, it was all over the place. And Resident Evil 4 really said, look, this is how you do it. And they did it, and they did it. They got it right the first time. And that's why, to me, when it came to recommending a game to you, this to me had to be one of those absolutely essential gaming experiences that you should have. And the Wii version is by far one of the best versions of that game, in my opinion, still.
Yeah, I have to say, getting back into using a Wii Remote nunchuck was actually quite pleasant. I do miss that day and age, and I've always heard a lot of great things about Resident Evil 4. Like, for the longest time, being a gamer myself, you keep up to date with these things, but sometimes you just never get around to playing it. And I guess you could say being pushed into Resident Evil 4 after a while made me end up, I guess you could say, you don't really need to know too much about the other games. So the plot for me was actually like, you're kind of put in, some of the characters already. I obviously know Leon S. Kennedy from just, constant other, I guess you say, games I've seen. So the plot of Resident Evil 4, as a quick summary, is basically about Leon S. Kennedy. He's on a rescue mission to, rescue the U.S. president's daughter, who's been captured by some weird cult.
The lovely Ashley.
the lovely Ashley with the shiny belt that you mentioned.
Yeah, with the ballistic missiles. Gotta love her.
When he said that line in the game, at least that guy you meet, I part of me was like, really? I didn't catch it at first, why he said it, and then I was like, I get what he meant, but I'm like, why would he even say that? So and they always have that kooky sense of humor where they're trying to be a little edgy, but it never really is enough, I suppose.
Yeah, and what's interesting about the story is that, in Resident Evil 2, Leon was this kind of bright-eyed, kind of bushy-tailed rookie. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of come back to Resident Evil 4, and here he is, this kind of, seasoned vet now, and I guess he went from being a rookie his first day on a job to being assigned to bring back the president's daughter. I guess, I mean, it's pretty quick timing, right? He must have just kind of rose through the ranks like a mother effort to go from rookie to bringing back the president's daughter. But hey, you know what? It's a nice setup, and Leon is one of my favorite Resident Evil characters, and I liked it.
Yeah, I got the feeling watching it that, knowing his past history as a cop, part of me, when I see him fought, I get the feeling it's almost heavily implied in the game that he almost got military training, because the way he fights, especially with a knife later in the game, is very reminiscent of, I guess you could say, like a Navy SEAL or something like that. I mean, he's definitely a lot more experienced in a way of combat that you wouldn't really think of like, a cop. So yeah. So in the end, when you actually get into the village for the first time, and you see all these different types of people or villagers, and I actually didn't expect. I actually thought there'd be a zombie-like thing at the beginning, but when you actually reach the village in that, I guess say, rural, godforsaken area, which is very different from other Resident Evil games. It is quite interesting to take a sense of the environment.
So I guess we should talk about the village, right? So the village is in Spain, and like we said, Leon gets sent to to bring back the president's daughter. It is in Spain, and once he gets there right away, it kind of is pretty ominous, right? He starts kind of, things aren't right, and he kind of he has the aid of these kind of wacky local policemen and
Who don't last very long.
yeah, and very quickly he's introduced, I think, to the villagers, and which are just as creepy and kind of ominous themselves.
Yeah, they don't speak a lick of English either. So I think it was funny that you were telling me some of the things that they were saying that were as actually kind of funny, especially the whole like behind you. Even though,
Yeah,
like, why would anyone tell you behind you?
yeah. It's funny because if you know Spanish, then it gives you a slight advantage because you could kind of hear what they're saying. So they'll say things like behind you, or I'm coming after you, or I'm gonna make you into kind of, I'm gonna cut you up, and stuff like that, and it gives you audio cues of what's happening, and if you know what to listen for, then you could get out of the way and run away. So whenever I would hear in Spanish, behind you, I would always just start running right away because I knew that I was a second away from getting hit in the back from something.
Yeah, and while playing, when I was playing, so I thought to myself, wait, is Resident Evil 4, like, does it just have, like, a bunch of crazy, villagers in a cult? But you do find out story-wise that this crazy thing, which starts to sound very much more Resident Evil, is supposedly some type of parasite that is actually within this entire village. And I got the feeling while playing the game that it gets creepier, a lot creepier as you move in, which surprised me big time while I was playing. A lot of surprises in regards to this. Probably probably more so than just a typical zombie, I guess you could say facade on it.
Yeah, and the parasite is called Las Plagas, right? Which is pretty creepy. It's kind of like a play on, the, like, kind of saying the plague, in English.
Yeah, there's a lot of Hispanic influence in this game, big time.
Yeah. So the story setup is quite different from your normal Resident Evil fare. It even starts out with saying the Umbrella Company is no more, which at the time every single Resident Evil game involved Umbrella. So seeing that kind of Umbrella just fade and kind of disappear was pretty bold and shocking. I'd say the first time I saw that. Not now in most Resident Evil's, Umbrella doesn't play a big role like they did back in the early games, but at that time that was a big shift for Resident Evil.
I think so, because one end of playing it, not to mention you're no longer in what they call a very closed environment. In the game, it's actually set in, I guess, in a kind of, I say, the countryside, wide out in the open, which most Resident Evil games did not do. Very city-like, very corridor-like. I mean, even in the first game, while it's in a forest, you are in a mansion the whole time.
Yeah, and right away, these aren't really kind of zombies, right? So no, they're more, they still have zombie qualities, but these villagers. It's really a sad story when you think about it because. These guys, these villagers were probably kind of just going about their normal life, and their whole existence just kind of got upended by, these kind of, the parasite, the Las Plagas, and then all the kind of shady players behind this, which I think the first one you actually meet is a huge gentleman called Bitores Mendes, right?
Yes,
a pretty creepy fellow with a beard.
Yeah, Lovely called him Rasputin. I mean, he was
yeah,
he was literally the epitome of Rasputin, and my goodness, did he love grabbing Leon S. Kennedy by the throat.
Yeah, and this game loves to do like, this is the bad guy. Oh, wait, no, this guy was kind of the strings. There's another guy behind this guy, and he's pulling all the strings. But wait. This guy's strings were actually pulled by another guy, right? So
yeah, I mean, I feel like they did it in a very different order. You had large, then you went small, then you went medium.
That's true. That's a good observation. You're right. Right? Well, okay. Well, speaking of small, after this gentleman, Bitores Mendes, which is the huge guy with the beard that you meet early on, after him, is it the what is it, Ramon Salazar? This kind of
Salazar,
creepy little, almost
creepy, nasally
Napoleon-looking
little,
guy,
yeah, calm
right?
little
Like
nymph.
Napoleon, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it was just a nasally, what's it called, crude little guy who just loved trolling you through a huge portion of the game.
Yeah, and you kind of you had that kind of creepy high pitched voice, right? Like I'm gonna get you, Leon. Like kind of like really just really high pitched and kind of cartoonish, but kind of fun in a way, right? He was just
Yeah.
kind of pathetic.
Yeah, at first it doesn't seem like he makes much sense until you start to get an idea of the history by just kind of exploring, like the castle and the areas and reading certain things. You find out that actually this whole thing was like a kind of a country. I wouldn't say a country, but more like, I guess you could say like a village, almost a monarchy kind of area that was by itself until
Yeah.
this man behind the scenes who goes by Salazar, not Salazar, pardon me, Sadler. And you just get a sense that this one guy was able to upend the whole thing. And it's actually a very creepy, dark story involving these villains.
Yeah, and funny enough, Sadler, you actually meet him kind of early on in the game, really.
Yeah, without knowing he's the main bad guy.
Yeah, yeah, and he's pretty creepy, and for the time, his kind of facial animations and expressions they're pretty top notch for the time, and they it really kind of gave you a sense that this guy was you didn't know maybe that he was at the time pulling all the strings, but there was something off about him, and Capcom did a good job of introducing him early on and kind of keeping him in the background the whole game. You felt his presence, right? But at the same time, there was other bad guys that you had to deal with before you even dealt with this guy.
Yeah, and despite that, I think it's amazing that the game was longer than I expected, and it still was able to include either nods, but also characters from past games, and even a few side villains in the game that actually do not feel like they take what they call a portion of the time away. It feels like they incorporate very well. Like when Ada Wong first appears for the first time, and
Yeah.
she's wearing the classic dress that everyone knows her to be wearing from number 2. It was, in my opinion, for a lot of people who saw that for the first time in a, I guess you could say at the time, a high render, was probably pretty it was probably pretty steamy for them. I'll give you that.
No, yeah, I mean, this is, next to Resident Evil 2, this was one of the best incarnations of Ada Wong. They really did a great job kind of, representing her. She still had her kind of secret agent thing from part 2, but, she kicked even more ass, really. And, you never quite knew what she was up to. She still supported Leon because they've always had kind of that connection, but
Yeah.
never enough to truly be on his side, right? You just never knew really what was going on with her and what side was she on. You just never knew.
Yeah, she seems like the type of lady who the reason why she helps him is because she likes him, even though she's got a big agenda that she's just doing her job.
That's true, and it seems like Leon is like, oh Ada, oh you Ada, you got me again, and he just keeps letting her go,
Yeah, it's basically the Catwoman to his Batman.
Yeah,
much.
yeah, that's actually a very very good comparison. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and there's some smaller villains that are kind of introduced. I guess say slightly out of nowhere, but enough to where I actually really enjoyed them nonetheless. Like
Yeah.
Jack Krauser, his first introduction was actually really really good.
Oh yeah, and he actually comes kind of later in the game, doesn't he?
Much later, like I didn't expect. You get a nod that someone else is there. You might have to deal with later. But the first real time that he's given a lot of limelight is a very impressive sequence.
Yeah.
That impressed me, especially for someone who's I guess you say reliving a GameCube era game on the Wii.
And what's cool is that him and Leon kind of have some history there, right? So and there's this kind of and Ada Wong is involved with him too. I guess Ada Wong and him are kind of it's kind of their plan, and then they kind of unravel some of the history that Jack has with Leon. So by the time you get to Jack, there's a lot of it's a little bit more personal. It's not, Ramon Salazar is just a goofy character, and Torres Mendez is, some weird, huge kind of monster almost that you take down. But Jack Krauser has a little bit more of a personal theme.
Yeah, and he sprinkled very delicately throughout the later half of the game, which feels actually more like a true, I guess, a battle in so many different stages than possibly other characters who show up to kind of troll Leon before you end up doing like a boss. I felt Jack Krauser really was the one where there were multiple sides to having to deal with him, and I could see it was a smart decision, because if you want to give people a better idea of the history between two characters that has never actually been shown in any of the other games, then you have to handle it more delicately than just if you're doing what they call villain of the I won't say of the week, but I guess you'd say of the couple hours, villain of the couple hours.
Well, the bad guys in this game are pretty memorable. I would think, at least they were for me. But also Leon kind of had help throughout his journey, right? He wasn't alone.
Oh, Hannigan. Oh my goodness.
Hannigan, yeah.
Ingrid Hannigan. I don't know what it was about her that made me just really not care when she popped in, like, Otacon for Snake. I don't know what it was. I felt like they were trying, and she's pretty much just practically a footnote, before it even reaches the middle of the game.
Yeah, I mean, yes and yeah, but funny enough, she's actually survived the series, and she's been in other games in the series, right? So Capcom really does like her, even though Leon is kind of thirsty for her. Hannigan has none of his shenanigans. She's all business. She's like, you know what, Leon, just continue with your mission, right? And even though Ashley is throwing herself at Leon just really is thirsty for Hannigan. I don't know what's going on there, but maybe some Christmas party or something.
No, she's like the forbidden fruit, but actually she's actually a common. I wouldn't say common, but I think they based Ingrid Hannigan off of I won't say a common trope, but there was a caricature in even older films and TV shows where you'd have this lady who was very friendly in like a police department kind of section, and she always knows what's going on. Very friendly, but she's never friendly enough where a person can date her. And I kind of get the feeling that it's a used trope, except it's done in a probably much more subtle way, and obviously it's done more modern. It's over the comm, the lady in the seat and everything.
Yeah, for me, I was indifferent, right? Like,
it is very.
She didn't bother me.
She's small time in Resident Evil 4.
Yeah, she didn't bother me. It's like she's almost like a plot device. She kept the plot moving. Anytime you took care of a boss or some big event, Leon would kind of hop on his comms and chat with Hannigan, and then move the plot along. That's what it seemed like to me.
I mean, sometimes I felt like it wasn't even moving the plot along. I feel like if she was just reminding Leon every single chance she could get that his mission was to save the president's daughter, and I found that just hilarious.
Yeah, but a character that to me was a lot more memorable than Hannigan was Luis Serra.
Yeah,
right. He was a cool dude. He was a cool dude.
He was. I would say, like, I think first time seeing him, I kind of got the fact he felt like, the kind of pardon me. I kind of felt that he was a little bit more of a slapstick like character at the beginning. But he really comes into his own later in the game, and I actually grew fond of him later on.
Yeah, he was kind of like he has some funny lines at the beginning, and he could have gone into kind of the slapstick character, but I don't think he ever became that really. They did a good job of balancing his character with being kind of serious but also lighthearted.
Mm-hmm. Man, let's not forget when Leon, made him into a floor sandwich. That one time after he tried to fight Rasputin. That made me bust up laughing.
Yeah, that didn't go well. Scene. He grabs him by the foot and flips him over and ends up
because Leon's like, I can.
Yeah,
Leon's like, I can take this guy with my kick, and that doesn't work out so well.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You know who Luis reminds me of? So
Who?
if you ever play the Bayonetta series, there's a character
Yeah.
that's always going
Oh,
after
yes.
Bayo, and
Why do I
they're
forget his
yeah,
name?
their kind of character design is very similar. I don't remember his name either, but
You know,
when I
she calls him Cheshire. She calls him Cheshire, but that's not his name.
yeah,
It's
so if his
it's
character
a
design
Hispanic.
is
He's
very
gotten
similar.
yeah, and he's got an Hispanic name too. I just don't remember what it was.
Yeah,
It's not Luis, even though for
no,
some reason I
no.
get a small feeling it's
I don't know. I
similar,
don't know if that character was influenced by
inspired.
Lewis. Yeah, inspired. Yeah, inspired. But when I played Bale, that character really reminded me of Lewis.
Yeah, definitely. I could see a lot of the common you say common staples between the characters. Similar dress wear too. But yeah, I have to say that his character, I grew fond of him. They started off in a way where I didn't expect a character like him to show up, and when you start to find out why that person is there, with a lot of sprinkled details that happen in the game, I kind of feel like the game subtly finds ways, if you're exploratory enough, it subtly finds ways to make the characters that it's trying to have an impact even more memorable than you actually expect. So
Yeah.
it's quite funny. Except I think the thing that made me probably give quite a bit of a giggle is how the villains love to write their plans almost like a diary.
Yeah,
Goodness,
they
I
do love
loved
to
it.
talk, don't they? Yeah.
It's like I wouldn't call it Saturday morning, but I would definitely say, goodness, that is some really great writing for these
Yeah,
villains
no,
in their
and
diaries.
you know, at some points Leon just doesn't have it. Leon has no patience for these guys. He even, you know, he kind of snaps back at them and makes fun of them. And at one point, he even threw a knife at poor Ramon Salazar. You know, the poor guy. All he was
One
doing
of the
was just
best scenes ever. I felt
yeah.
so gratified.
He's in the middle of his kind of monologue and his evil and Leon is like, you know what? I don't have time for this dude. I'm looking for Ashley. Leon was very focused. I'll tell you that. He wasn't having it.
Yeah, I'd say what surprised me the most about the game is, despite some of it trying to be a little what they call I wouldn't say pun centric when it comes to Leon, and I like to say he's got a lot of dad jokes, but what surprised me a lot with the game is the very subtle sense of visual humor and silence between certain scenes, which actually made, when it did happen, it feel very cinematic. The game is made very cinematically, which is very impressive when you think of going from 1, 2, 3, and then
Yeah.
4, and 4 is like, I gotta say, it's shot like a movie, and
No,
it's impressive
you're
how
right.
well it manages it.
No, you're right. And the series always had a very cinematic flair, I think. But the power of the GameCube really allowed Capcom to kind of go nuts and really, if you look at modern Capcom, Resident Evil 4, you could really see the seeds of modern Capcom with, you know, their cinematic heavy storytelling. Really you could see it from the beginning with the PlayStation games, but you know the animations were very kind of super basic, and the arm is just moving up and down like, you know, like like Chuck E. Cheese kind of puppets. And but Resident Evil 4 and GameCube is really when they got they just went nuts with the, you know, motion capture and animation, and you know it was very very advanced for its time.
Yeah, and to think actually that when I actually saw that, the scenes that were done, and even normal animations in the game, there's a lot of what they call small animations that are could almost call them one-off animations that you only see like maybe 1 or 2 times in the game. And they're done very well, and I was kind of curious, like, was a lot of this motion captured? And lo and behold, by the end of it, you're right, when I saw that they were motion captured, I'm like, damn, like, they actually decided to do a lot of that back then. And it makes
Yeah.
sense because these days a lot of Capcom games are very heavily motion captured because they love
Yeah.
trying to get that cinematic quality.
You know, another thing that I like about the plot is that it kind of gave Capcom an excuse to kind of have Leon, and you know, he at the end of the day, he's still in the village and he's still in Europe, but he goes to so many locales, right? I mean, he starts out with the village, and then he goes to like a castle. He goes to a village, and then he goes to a castle, and then, you know, he goes to kind of like this military base, and you know, he's also in the lab at some point, and he, you know, they do a lot with their setting to move the plot along, right? It's kind of amazing if you think about It is a long game, but if you think about all the locales that you visit, it's quite amazing.
It is actually because I felt like each area was incredibly distinct, and every area that I went to, there was so much variety. The game definitely does not lack in variety when it actually comes to all the environments and the things you do. It was very impressive. I actually expected it to be shorter. It ended up being a lot longer than I actually thought. So, so there was actually an interesting little tidbit in regards to the development of the game when they actually were deciding to bring it to PlayStation 2 or GameCube, that the director did not want it to go to PS2 at all, because he thought at the time that Sony was just going to have a bunch of kiddie titles, and he was very afraid.
I remember
Yeah.
hearing about that, which is it's funny to think about now, right? Isn't it?
It's ironic, actually.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, so
And
yeah, another thing too. This was I don't know if you remember, but this was part of the Capcom 5.
the Capcom 5 team.
No, 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 no. So what it was, okay, so Capcom made a deal with Nintendo. And I remember where I was when this happened. It was that night when I heard about this. It blew my mind away because Capcom had always been with Sony. And then Capcom decided to make a deal with Nintendo and bring 5 exclusive games to the GameCube, including Resident Evil exclusivity. It just absolutely blew my mind, right? If during that time when Resident Evil was all Sony, except for maybe 1 or 2 titles, the Dreamcast, Code Veronica, but it was just a Sony title, right? Nintendo kind of got the scraps. They got a Resident Evil 2 port, which is amazing, but still, it came like 2 years after the original game, right? But this was a Sony franchise, and then Sony lost it to Nintendo of all companies, right? Like the kiddie company, they lost it to Nintendo. So this Capcom 5, and let me see if I remember them. It was Resident Evil 4, it was Killer 7, like amazing game. It was Beautiful Joe, it was PNO 3, I think it's called.
I remember that one.
I forgot the name of that game, which it wasn't very good. And then there was another game called Phoenix something, which got canceled ultimately. It never made it, which unfortunately it kind of sucked because it kind of sounded interesting, but they didn't. That tells you how that deal went. They never even completed the 5. It was really the 4, and one of them sucked.
Yeah, and I actually remember thinking to myself, how did it even come to the point where Nintendo was the one that received, I guess you'd say, what was considered to be one of the greatest Resident Evil experiences on its console, when you think of the majority of games coming out even between 2000 and 2005, you would think that actually there would be a different opinion based on the different types of either games like Final Fantasy X, or even quite a few rated M games that came out even before 2005.
There kind of was, because Capcom decided to make a PS2 port, and they announced it even before Resident Evil 4 launched for the GameCube. So, it's kind of silly because Resident Evil 4 for the GameCube hadn't even come out yet, and then Capcom goes ahead and announced that they're making a PS2 port, almost cutting the legs off the GameCube version, really. So the writing was on the wall. They knew already that, whoops, maybe this wasn't the greatest decision, and they, reversed course. They still continued making the GameCube version. Obviously, it was the main SKU, but they were already, well into plans as far as porting the game over to the PS2.
But as I recall, though, it actually greatly benefited the development of Resident Evil 4 based on all the different techniques they were able to use that the PS2 was unable to support at the time.
Yeah. So, well, let me go back to something you said. You said one, the GameCube actually got two great Resident Evil games. The Resident Evil remake, which came out a couple months after the GameCube launched, which is considered one of the greatest survivor horror games ever made, including by me. And it got Resident Evil 4. So it got 2 of the best entries in the series, which is it's pretty interesting. And they got Resident Evil 0 too, but you're right. The game really benefited from the GameCube's extra horsepower. The game looked amazing. I mean, it was one of the most, it was one of the most visually impressive games of that era. It went toe to toe with anything in that era, in my opinion.
Yeah, and when you really think about it, it came out in 2005, probably, what was that, about a year before the PS3. And while I played the whole game, Resident Evil 4, it was actually kind of baffling that some of the models were so high and detailed that you could almost throw Leon in an early PS3 game and maybe just add some extra lighting and a couple extra textures, but it was actually very impressive due to that amount of power that I did not know that the GameCube could even. I knew there were great looking games on the GameCube, but I didn't realize that it could actually pump out that many polygons more than actually the PS2.
No, it's true. The GameCube was capable of more polygons than the PS2. I mean, the Leon model itself was like almost 9,000 polygons, if not more than 9,000, and they cut that, almost in half for the PS2 release. You could really tell where a lot of those polygons were lost, either in geometry in the background environment, like the tree branches, etc., or just Leon himself, which has a little bit more of a kind of blocky side of it. And in fact, the higher poly models were used in the cutscenes, right? That's normally where you use your high poly models, but the PS2 couldn't use those high poly models. It just couldn't. So what they did is they recorded all the GameCube cutscenes, and then the PS2 played them back. So they weren't even, real time.
Well,
cutscenes.
And you could actually tell. You would tell they were videos too, because the quality dipped quite a bit when it came to the recording of the videos. Because
that and the costumes, because when you picked a unique costume and the cutscene played, it would always have the generic Leon jacket, because it wouldn't take into account the unique costume you were wearing. Where in the GameCube, if you were wearing one of the special costumes and a cutscene triggered, you would be wearing that special costume in the cutscene.
Yeah, I find it's one of those, well, I wouldn't say rare instances of in-game usage, but when it came to, I guess you say, the quality of it, I mean, there are games these days who, at least, way back then, even during the PS3 and 360 area, that actually didn't do a lot of in-game stuff. A lot of things were videos. So it's actually pretty impressive for a game that old, I guess you could say, to do it so immaculately well.
Yeah, Yeah, and that was one of the rare GameCube games that came on 2-disc, right? There wasn't a whole lot of games that came on 2-disc. Capcom had a lot of them. Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil 0 both came in 2-disc, and so did Resident Evil 4. And it was put to good use. It sounded great. It actually had better sound than the PS2 version. The sound was punchier and higher quality. So it really, really showed what the GameCube could do. The frame rate was steady as well.
Well, I was gonna say that. I remember actually telling you when I played it that I was actually very impressed with the sound quality. There's lots of little tiny noises that you could hear, whether in the distance or from enemies or the weather around you. That for someone like me, who when you play these games purposely at night to get the experience, those quiet moments or those small sounds are very important when making a survival horror game, even in an action-like setting.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say about the GameCube, the knock on it visually, is that it's not true widescreen. It has letterbox, so it has the black bars on top and on the bottom, but it's not true widescreen. It was still 4:3, so you had the black boxes on the sides and you had black boxes on the top and the bottom. That's the only knock I would put on the game, really.
Yeah, it did take me a little bit to actually get used to when I ended up playing the Wii variant of it. But I have to say, for it being how should I put it? For it actually being having to look close up to it, it was impressive to look at, where my eyes actually adapted to it. I guess it was it's probably due to a bit of the quality, but it also was one of the first games. It was a huge shift for Resident Evil because it was the first game in their franchise to do the over shoulder combat, and
yes, huge.
And to think that it did it so well the first time ever doing it,
Yeah,
which, I mean, don't get me wrong, it took me a while to get quite a bit used to. You know, you aim, you can't move. That's the part that's actually can be a little for me playing so many games that do that. But it did
yeah.
add to
That
the
that was one of
terror.
your early struggles, right? The fact that you
Yeah.
couldn't shoot while moving.
Hmm.
But the game was designed around that. It's almost like the comparison I would make is the original Castlevania for the NES. When you jump, you can't change your trajectory when you jump. You're committed to your jump, and if you make a mistake, then that's it. But it's not a problem because the game was designed around that mechanic, so it's fine, right? So it's the same thing with Resident Evil 4. Something that seems very limiting, it was done with a purpose, and the game was designed around it. So it's not unfair. You do get surrounded by enemies, but it's not unfair. The game was designed around that. It builds tension, right? You're if you were able to move while shooting, it would have broken the game as it's
Yes.
designed.
I would definitely say that tension sometimes would get really, really high, I have to say. Because they were not afraid of being like, this is not only survival horror, but this is an action title. And they
Oh,
were very
absolutely.
big
Yeah.
on making you feel like you were having to be it actually made you have to be very smart to survive when it came to being swarmed, or when you found a new enemy that had a different type of tactic or thing that was difficult to use against it. You really had to consider everything within your arsenal and the environment. And it not only made for great action, but it made you feel very good about yourself when you pulled it off.
Yeah, another thing I liked, and Resident Evil 4 didn't. This is not something that they came up with. Games have been using it forever. Kind of contextual button presses, right? So like, to bust out of the window, you press A. To climb up a ladder, you press A. To hop down, you press A. To do most actions, it's just A, right? Very
Yep.
simple, very elegant, right? It's not, like I said, it's not nothing new. Games like Ocarina of Time were doing that even before, where everything was very contextual and you didn't have to press a million buttons to do a lot of things. You just press A and the game would decide what is A doing in that moment. It's very contextual. So very smart, very elegant. They kept it simple. Really, if you died, most of the time it was just your fault. The game was nearly perfect at the time.
Yeah, it's a very fair game. Even though they throw a lot at you, I would say I definitely felt very fair. Though I have to say one of the things that it benefited greatly, in regards to mechanics when they did re-release it for the Wii was the Wii remote controls. I feel
Yeah,
as you said, it
it
was the best version to play.
yeah, it is, because you could play with the Wii mode controls, or you could play with the GameCube controls. So you kind of have the best of both worlds. You know, the Wii controls are really, really, really good. It does make the game easier though, for sure. So, if you thought that the Wii game was tense, try playing it with a GameCube, and it gets even more tense because you just can't shoot four guys in the kneecap in a second. You have decisions to make. You can't get to all of them at once, so you have to do some real hard, in the moment decisions with a control scheme that's slower. Not worse, because the game was designed for it, but the Wii version does make it easier, and the controls are fantastic.
I feel like it was a perfect blend though between it, that they realized using the Wii remote could benefit the gameplay. I would say that yes, it does make it a hell of a lot easier, but one thing I do appreciate is it also probably made it feel, just to me at least, as far as I know, a tad bit cooler when you pulled off something, because of that what they call very precise way of aiming that feels almost like a mouse that you're using with the Wii remote.
For sure, for sure. Another thing I really like about the mechanics is like that they add a lot of variety. So you're in the boat, and all of a sudden the mechanics switch, and you're shooting a monster with harpoons or spears, and or you may be in a truck that's barreling down, or they really kind of add quite a few mechanics, and I think successfully, honestly. I think they do a good job of adding variety. Some stuff is, it's not great, kind of like the quick time events that kind of give you some instant deaths if you're not ready for them.
I have to say that the quick time events definitely sometimes come by surprise, where you die in I'd almost call it a slightly hilarious way. But there were a few other times though where they just incorporated something gameplay wise that
Yeah. Well, what you think
like
of the
you
Jack
just
Krauser quick time event fight?
the Jack Hauser quick time event by I thought visually it was very impressive. I didn't think it was too hard, even though he got me like I think one time. But I have to say it was what they say, one of those beautiful examples of early quick time events in a game that for me seeing that it is tantamount for me to saying that it was close to games I've played today that have, I guess, better incorporated quick time events. But the quick time events for me never felt like they were badly implemented. I felt like they were a kind of a nice little distraction to give you something kind of hectic or like very I wouldn't say blood boiling, but kind of like very,
Tense moment.
adrenaline
Tense.
pumping. A very
Yeah,
adrenaline
no,
pumping, because the game is very
I agree.
tense and you have to keep track of a lot of different things while playing the game. And it's like a nice little break. But there were a couple times where it didn't require button prompting at all. There would be situations coming to, like one of the villagers literally driving a car down a really, really short road, and you're just like thinking at first, you think, I'm gonna shoot the tire, and then you die, and you realize,
that's one of
I
the
should shoot the guy in the car.
that's one of the difference between, the villagers, right, and zombies. So zombies are pretty stupid, right? Or the what are they what are they called in Resident Evil 4? They're the Los Luminados, right? So the Los Luminados, and the other Resident Evil games, they're stupid zombies. They're slow.
They're classic. Classic.
Yeah, the real danger comes from other, kind of, like the hunter and other enemy types that are a lot faster and that kind of work against the control scheme you have, but. The Luminados, I mean, they're smart, right? They use snipers, they drive trucks, and even later in the game they have machine guns, and I'm like, holy crap, right? Like these guys.
Two variants I disliked, but they were fun when you got used to them, were the bomb wielding ones and the scythe throwing ones. But once you got used to being able to, one of the accidental things, shooting a scythe being thrown at you midair is probably one of the nicest feelings in that game. And then I think it was you who told me if you shot the hand of a grenader, he actually can explode and damage other ones.
Yeah, they could blow up, and they blow up in their hand if you shoot it. And really, if you know how the game is set up so you could take advantage of them as well. If you shoot them in the knee, they go down to their knee and they conveniently hold a stick of dynamite up in the air. So if you're able to get it in time, then you could take out a crowd of some of those villagers at once.
And to think none of it's explained to you. Like, there's so many mechanics.
No, you're right, yeah.
In that game that they don't explain it to you. They don't explain to you that shooting in the leg will bring them down for you to use your knife. They don't explain shooting, things weapons out of midair. And they don't explain that when enemies are near an edge. That's like the biggest, easiest way to get rid of them is just shooting them and they fall off the ledge.
But even though they don't explain it to you, I still think that the game does a good job of conveying everything to you.
Yes, like it's very surprising because they put you in situations that allow you to find out these mechanics. And as you find them out, you realize that it makes the game that feels challenging, it makes it feel like you can actually smartly utilize these mechanics to help you in very tense situations.
Yeah, and as an old Resident Evil dog myself, one of the biggest mechanic changes, really, and I'm glad I remembered because it's a huge change for the series, is the way item management was handled, right? The Capcom always struggled how to do this. They had the boxes where, if you put something in one inventory box, then magically you could pull it anywhere else in the mansion, right? It was kind of magic. And they tried to kind of move away from that in Resident Evil 0, where you could drop items anywhere, and so they got rid of the boxes. You could drop items anywhere, and you always had to come back to that item. It would mark it on the map, and you could come back and pick it up. But it just didn't work, right? Like if you were somewhere else and you needed, oh my goodness, I dropped a key item. Well, you had to run all the way back to where you first dropped it and get it. and in that way the boxes were just more intuitive. But here, one of the biggest innovations was kind of like your inventory box, right? Like these suitcases. And so, you kind of being, new to Resident Evil 4, how did you feel that they handled the inventory in that game versus some of the older entries?
Well, I would definitely say that playing the older entry, you're right, it is very limited. Very limited in how they made you select things. Now, I would say that having experience in playing a couple of the games that utilize the Resident Evil 4 inventory, I would definitely say when it comes to inventory management, there's so many different types, but Resident Evil 4 never felt like it was unfair in its management system. It felt like they gave you just enough to collect things, to know what to trade, what to discard, what to move around. And
welcome, stranger.
Yes,
the shady.
Yes,
I'm like, holy, like
shady trader, and
yeah, I was like, holy shit, like what?
And I love how I would sometimes get very obsessed with how my inventory was managed because of how you could organize
very OCD,
it so precisely. I became just so wanting to make sure that everything was in a position that I could grab quickly. And the only thing that I found inconvenient, obviously, was the constantly having to go in inventory to switch your weapon.
It's true. It is missing the kind of D-pad inventory, quick selected other future games.
I would say though that when you get used to it, you get used to it very quickly. And for some reason, there was almost a humorous aspect to it where sometimes you're dealing with all these enemies, and you end up looking into your inventory because like, oh, you're like, I'm gonna use this on him, and it almost makes me think of a funny thing of like this guy, reaching into his pocket to pull out like a bazooka or something,
This is a deep cut, but it reminds me of Link's Awakening for the Game Boy, where to access your inventory, you had to press you were always pressing start to manage your inventory, and something a lot of people complain about that game. But the reason I feel it actually works in Resident Evil 4, so if you play the new Resident Evils, it has kind of like a live inventory management system where, you select your gun or different things on the fly, but at the same time you could be hit by a zombie or whatever the hell's chasing you at the time. And Resident Evil 4 is a little bit like Mass Effect, right? Where in Mass Effect you could freeze the game, select a different weapon, and then unfreeze it, and it really gives you that moment to say, okay, I'm in a bad situation right now, let me take a minute to think what I'm going to do. So pressing that start button says, okay, take a breather. I'm low on energy. I'm about to die. I'm surrounded by like a bunch of these crazy ass villagers. Let me regain my health. Let me switch to the rocket launcher, to the shotgun, and blah blah blah. And it really gives you that little kind of moment to gather your bearings and then say, all right, put me back in, coach. I'm ready. Right? That's kind of how I see it. I like it.
It really was, because I felt like it was a small, nice little breather when things got very intense. I would think, oh my god, like I need to use a different weapon right now. And you end up pulling up your inventory really quickly to pull out like a shotgun because someone's getting a little too close than you like.
Yeah.
And it became very quickly, you could do it very quickly too. It became very nifty. And yeah, I actually really, really like the inventory. And a fun little note is that I can tell that they're bringing it back in a very beautiful way for Resident Evil 8, which I'm very excited about since I became a fan of it for Resident Evil 4.
And and before we move on to mechanics, I don't think we're forgetting much else. At least not something that comes to memory. But we gotta talk about how awesome the merchant is, right? I mean, the merchant is iconic. He's creepy. He's just there like, he doesn't care. It's like the battle between demons and angels. He's not picking a side. He's just there to support, right? Kind of like on the sidelines, and he's so shady. He just his trench coat. He just kind of pulls it to the side. He's like, what will you have, right? Like,
Yeah,
he's just there to make a quick buck, man.
Because somehow this weird merchant, literally in the cusp, in the midst of, I guess you could call it like a horrible pandemic of crazy viruses and parasites.
Seriously.
That this guy's just like, this looks like a nice place to set up shop,
Yeah.
And then, you got your lone hero popping in. He's like, perfect. This is the guy I need.
Resident Evil 4 predicted 2020 and 2021. That's what I said. It was the it was the prophecy.
But he's a funny character. But one thing I want to mention is the mechanics that I ended up testing in a very I'd say a very dark kind of manner, just to see if the game actually did
I almost forgot about that.
And and let's not forget the Ashley meeting Ashley the first time, where I wanted to chastise Hannigan for constantly telling me, don't remember, protect the president's daughter. Don't remember, protect the president. I'm like, good God, I can't wait for her to stop saying that.
Okay, so
what do I do when I first meet her?
I gotta tell this story because I was actually watching you live on stream, right? And this was awesome because you got to the part where you finally save Ashley. It's this whole thing. You're there to save Ashley. Hannigan keeps talking to you about saving Ashley. Ashley. Finally, you get to the point where Ashley is following you, and then you turn around. And I think I even mentioned, I think I'm the one that said, hey, look, turn around and swing your knife and see what happens. Because I know from experience that Ashley was going to duck, which is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. It's a little cool.
And she did.
Thing.
She
did. But you're like, you know what? I'm going to take it a step further. So can you dodge this bitch? And then you look down and you swipe your knife at her, wounding her mortally. I
wasn't that crude about it. I was just like, I wonder. And I got my answer very quickly. It's that simple.
Well, let me tell you, next time you test a mechanic like that, don't do it on the president's daughter, right? I mean, go find one of these villagers and test it on them, but not the president's daughter. They tend to get mad when you swipe a knife at their guts.
Yeah, I would say that at least through the majority of the game after that, they make it so that it's very hard to hit her, because she moves behind you.
No.
I would say
they made it hard from the beginning. It's just some fool had to turn around, look down at her as she's quivering. I mean, she's literally ducking and saying, "Please don't hurt me." And she's traumatized already from her experience. And here comes this guy saying, "Come with me if you want to live." And then you turn around and it's like, "Whoops, just kidding. I'm gonna slash you with this commando knife."
It's Leon's slip of the hand, okay? It was just a slip of the hand. But the thing is, I would definitely say that they did a good job of making escort missions.
That's true.
Which actually was an off and on thing through the game, because Ashley just can't stay saved to save her life. But
that's true.
It did not feel taxing having to save her. There were few moments that, due to me positioning myself in a bad way, I ended up hitting her while trying to take out a zombie, which was aggravating. But I did feel that if you're smart about it, if you're very careful about how you maneuver the camera or get an attack ready, it's actually impossible to hit her. And so it was a smart design that most games, when it comes to escorting, are absolute chores.
Yeah.
When it comes, everyone makes the joke about the escort missions.
You're right. Escort missions are terrible. But you know what? One smart thing that the game does is you'll reach a new area and there's like these little kind of, I don't know what they're like, boxes or something that you could go to them and say, Ashley, hide. And she hides. You could clear all the bad guys, right? And not even have to worry about her getting in the way because she's hiding. And then once you're done, you call her back and she comes. So they were very smart about it. I think so. But you know what? Before we move on, there's a few kind of rapid fire things that I want to mention. The blue medallions. There's these blue medallions scattered around the world early on, and if you shoot enough of them, they'll reward you with a new gun. I thought that was pretty cool. An early
nice gun.
Yeah, yeah, the chicken eggs that you could eat to regain your health, I thought was funny. Even snake eggs you could eat, which I thought was hilarious.
I will
And they could go bad
That's
too.
true.
They could go bad if you if you keep them in your inventory long enough. They go bad, and I
I feel
think
like
they
they
even
were.
hurt you.
I feel like there were just a lot of side little things they did in that game that were humorous, but they added what they call almost a more fun aspect to it than I
Yeah.
thought it was. I mean, hell, I got obsessed with finding all the chicken eggs, and it became useful later. So,
Now,
especially early on in the beginning.
I'm not sure. Did you get to play the Mercenaries kind of side mode?
I did not, though I
So
have had experience in Mercenaries in
so
other
so
games, but not in this one.
so you did play the some of the you played the Wii version, so it had the PS2 extras, right? So before we
Yes.
go into that, I want to give some quick mentions on the Mercenaries. That is one of the funnest modes in any Resident Evil I've ever played. It's so much fun. After I played the main game back in 2005, I went into the Mercenaries and I didn't expect much. I had played, almost every Resident Evil has one of those kind of modes where when you finish the game, it lets you kind of take these, kind of run through the game with all these weapons and stuff. And sometimes they randomize the rooms you enter. The door animation opens and you go into one room and then another room. They're not always connected, and it's a lot of fun. But Mercenaries was kind of like expanding on that, where it was almost like a horde mode, right? Before Gears of War, made that mode popular. It was like a horde mode. They just tossed all kinds of stuff at you, almost like the village, up to to the max, the village section, and you had to see how long you could survive with the weaponry you had and the health items, and it was just so much fun. It's kind of like a high score thing. Unfortunately, no internet to post your high score, but even without that, it's just tons of fun. One of my favorite modes ever, and they even they expanded on that in the new games like Resident Evil 5, and I think even the 3DS had kind of like a Mercenaries
Yeah.
mode type game.
Well, actually, you're right. It even spawned its own game on the
Yeah,
3DS, even though
yeah,
the rest of games after that actually contain a type of mode like that.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, that's all I have to say about that. There's more, obviously, but super fun extra mode. Uh, that there was the GameCube. That's really one of the GameCube had that one as well, and it got ported to the PS2. But then the PS2 got some extra goodies that the GameCube didn't get, right?
Yeah, it was we had Assignment Ada, and then we had Separate Ways, and I would say that I actually played a little bit the beginning of Separate Ways, which I enjoyed, even though it's basically kind of a little bit more the same in regards to style, except that you play Ada.
Yeah, yeah,
And she had some different mechanics, but I did like how they were. It was basically Separate Ways was like you could almost say little nuggets or sections. It's almost level based actually, where
yeah.
a thing in the game that you don't know the behind the story kind of things, and you find out that Ada in the main game, who you meet quite a few times, is already in the background. It kind of fills in those small little moments of, oh, that happened because she was doing this, or oh, I didn't know that it was her that caused that.
I really
And I
like that.
thought,
I
yeah,
really
I
like
thought it
that.
was really nice. Despite basically, I'd already played like 20. What was it? It took me like 25 hours, I think, to beat the game.
The main game,
And
right?
so
The main game.
the main game, yeah. And so playing that, I have to say, I did a little bit at the beginning. I never finished Separate Ways, even though I actually enjoyed quite a bit of it. I would say the Assignment Ada is mostly kind of like it's almost like a challenge. I wouldn't really connect it to the game.
It's like a little bonus Ada Wong mission kind of. There is some stuff there that ties into the main kind of overall plot, but
Mhm.
it is
Very lightly.
well,
Though.
yeah, it is. It is a lot more kind of side story than Separate Ways. Separate Ways, for a not nowadays that would just be a DLC story, right?
Pretty
But
much.
yeah, but for kind of like an extra, I thought it was pretty cool because you do get to see what Ada Wong was up to while Leon was doing his thing in the main game. Then you kind of flip the coin and then you see what Ada Wong was doing, and it ties into those big Ada Wong moments in the main game, and I really like that. It's a couple hours long, and I think you probably got 70% through it. Really, it's not that long, but I
Yeah.
like this. My favorite extra of the PS2 extras. Like I
Yeah,
didn't really
and
care for the costumes and stuff, but this one was cool.
yeah, they didn't even need to, but I thought it was just a nice thing. You can tell it's definitely PS2 based by the fact that it uses the videos for cutscenes. But
Yeah,
it was enjoyable, and the Wii one actually received like got I guess
everything.
say the benefits from both worlds. You
Yeah,
got the
yeah,
GameCube version, which was superior in visual quality and mechanics, and then you have the PS2 extras, and it's a really it really is
yeah.
considered to be the best
Well,
version. I could see why.
yeah, and I think this is a good opportunity to talk about all the ports. This game's legendary for its ports, right? And it all
Oh
started
yeah.
with the PS2 game, and I think this story here is almost as well known as, hey, did you know that Super Mario 2 was actually Doki Doki or whatever in Japan? Whatever. Is that one of those stories that everybody knows? And Shinji Mikami famously said, "If this game comes out to any other system than the GameCube, I'll chop off my head." Right? And well, and as a joke, I think in one of his future games, there's his head. You could find his head in the game, which is pretty funny. So I guess he came through with that promise.
Yeah, he was very adamant of it not happening because he felt it would be. Oddly enough, it's almost like he had some stigma, like if he thought that it'd be the death of like Resident Evil if they put it on a console like the PS2,
Yeah.
which I think's just hilarious, especially if you think of the legacy now of Nintendo
Well,
and
yeah,
Sony's very very different.
Well, the
So
PS2 is probably the most kind of well-known port of this game, maybe next to the Wii one, but I was split about this port. So it's definitely nowhere near as good-looking as the GameCube version, right? They do make a lot of compromises, but you know what? I'm not gonna hate on it. They added tons of extra content. They allowed a lot more people to play this amazing game. And for somebody like me that plays a lot of Switch games that are compromised visually, right? But sometimes with extra content like Dragon Quest 11, stuff like that, or Dragon Quest 8, PS2 port that made it to the 3DS, but it's kind of compromised visually. I would be a hypocrite if I say anything bad about this port, really. So I'm glad. Ultimately, I'm glad it came out and more people got to enjoy this classic.
yeah, I feel I'd say it was one of the most important games that should have been experienced by a lot of people.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah.
luckily Capcom made sure that everyone under the sun got to play it because they got ported to everything. It got ported to the 360 and PS3, right? Kind of some
And then
shoddy.
it got
They were kind
Yeah.
of some shoddy port. The PC got it was a pretty bad port as well. And what else got it? There's a mobile version that I owned, and it was bad, Joseph. It was really really bad. It was. We're not talking about mobile, phones now that are pretty powerful. We're talking about some garbage in the mid to
I
late
almost
2000s.
I get a feeling that they were just like knowing that because it was one of the most popular Resident Evil games ever that was renowned, they just started having it shot onto everything as quickly as possible.
Everything.
And
yeah.
I think it really was to them just kind of a money making opportunity. You can tell there wasn't a lot of care. Well, not to be too rude about it, but there's the HD version. Even the one that they released recently, not recently, but a while back on the Switch, which is basically just a version of the PS3 and Xbox 360 version.
Well, okay, so you know what? I'm gonna have to kind of push back on that a little. I don't think it is actually. It might. So that they kind of redid the port a little bit for the PS4, Xbox One version.
That's true.
And the Switch version is based on that one, but still, at the end of the day, no version has successfully ported over all the visual aspects of the GameCube version. Even the latest modern versions are kind of missing some of the GameCube special effects and stuff like that. That I'm not sure why. Maybe those effects were very dependent on the hardware they were running on, and they're hard to kind of bring over to a modern system. I'm not sure what the reason is.
I actually believe though that sometimes it is actually what they call missing code, because there are certain games where I think there are lots of stories actually of other games, including the Kingdom Hearts games, when they were moved over to a PS3 or PS4, that they actually had to redo immense amounts of code, or they actually had to refine old material. And sometimes these kinds of things are lost.
No,
and
that's
when you
true.
try to do, when you try to do remasters, it sometimes can be, unless you really, really expect to be doing something later, you can actually lose a lot of I guess you could say base data that is just hard to replicate, and sometimes they consider it not. Yeah,
and that happened recently with the Mass Effect kind of Ultimate Edition or whatever it's called that recently came out. They lost a piece of DLC because they lost the code. I don't know if you heard about that.
No, I remember. I actually did hear about that. It was a whole piece of DLC because they got corrupted.
Oh yeah, that's what it was. But you know what? In this case, I'm not sure if that's what's going on here, because if you remember the Metroid trilogy for Wii, the first Metroid game is missing effects.
Yes,
and which is interesting because the Wii is just a GameCube but more souped up. But for some reason, Retro just could not port this game 100% intact over to the Wii. It was missing some effects. So that kind of leads me to believe that the GameCube was doing something very specific that must be hard to port over to another system. Even a system like the Wii, which is basically, is basically like a GameCube, just more souped up.
I actually do wonder about that, because I almost feel... I get a sneaky suspicion that if we do get a Metroid Prime Trilogy HD for Switch and that effect is there, then I almost feel like it could have just been lost within whatever they were doing, and they probably didn't notice it till very, very late, and it didn't matter anymore. But I'm just saying that because
I don't think it will be there, though.
Because I think when it comes to effects, it's kind of like right now a hypothesis. I am just wondering actually that if we'll actually see that or not. But yeah.
I tend to think not. I think they're just gonna port over the same exact game. But are you sure that you're just not? Are you sure that you're not just admiring the GameCube and all of its splendor? Well, yeah, I am a GameCube fan, so but we'll see. But before we kind of move on from ports, I did want to take the time to mention another kind of. It's not necessarily a port, I guess, but. Dedicated fans have taken Resident Evil 4, and they said, you know what, Capcom, forget your ugly textures, because Capcom redid some of the textures for this new version, the one on the Switch and PS4 and Xbox One, and the textures just don't do a great job of of successfully translating the GameCube style. They kind of changed the art direction somewhat, not in the greatest way. So what the fans are doing is, some of them have even gone to these locations that Capcom went, the ones we spoke about earlier in the episode, Spain and Europe, and the fans have taken high quality assets, right, pictures and stuff, and using that, they've made high quality textures, and they're making their own HD version of Resident Evil 4 that just looks so much better. I mean, it looks like the GameCube version, but in HD, right? Because they have all these assets and stuff, and they're redoing the character models. I mean, it's such a great project. I really want to play it one of these days. And the reason I don't talk more about it is because I don't want to, I don't own this, and I haven't tried it out myself. But I saw the Digital Foundry video. I've seen screenshots, and it's just such a great project. I mean, the stuff they do is just amazing, right? And it makes you think. I mean, I know why Capcom probably doesn't do it, right? It costs, that they're saying, well, how much is it going to cost us? They just want to make a kind of quick and dirty buck with quick ports. But these fans really should be applauded for the work they're doing.
Yeah, it really does depend how much a developer wants to dedicate time into remasters, and how much they I mean, it's, when you think about it, you're basically giving off resources, it's money, it's team members. And remasters, I feel, I won't say like a dime a dozen these days, but it really is.
They are.
Well, yeah, actually, you're right.
Yeah, Skyward Sword. I'm sorry. Did that come out?
Calm down. Anyways, but
Do
It,
you
it
think
is
do you
it
think
is
Nintendo went to Skyloft and took high quality assets and
funny, very funny. Aren't you great? It's, as I said, it really just depends on how much the studio is willing to dedicate time. But when it comes to fan related projects, I mean, it's all on their own time. It's all on. It's like a hobby and a project. And you're right. I think it is very special when you have people dedicated enough that they care about something so much. They've got the resources to do it, that they're willing to go that far. And it shows you that that is what, when it comes to like projects, and I will even say this when it comes to developers who are working on new projects, the attention to detail is always the highest on projects that are new.
yeah.
And that, I think, is what it was for Resident Evil 4, because they were trying to achieve something that they had never done before, and they put everything they could into it, whether it was mechanics, whether it was the camera angle they had changed, the action feeling of it, whether or not you could move or not, basically, when shooting, the whole concept of I guess you could say using the environment and all these small details, and then the texturing, the modeling, the effects, some effects that aren't even needed whatsoever. It's always the strongest on new projects, and I just feel for fans who you're kind of getting into a new era. I won't say that it's like bad that developers are basically just kind of remastering a game and shooting out. I feel like in some cases, because hardware is starting to get lower on the spectrum of being able to find lower end hardware, and also like a Wii version of the game, like try finding a Wii version of the game Resident Evil 4, that you get the feeling that these remakes are just meant also to show you that yes, this is a great game. And even if some textures are a little shoddy, I mean, people who want to get into it will still enjoy the game.
And that's a good point.
So.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That, while I am kind of being a little negative on these ports or whatever, I understand the reason. And at the end of the day, I'm glad they're out there, right? Like, I'm glad that these games are available for everyone to play. Now, is it the best version the game could be? Maybe not in every case, right? But you know what? At least it's out there, and people like yourself who never got a chance to play it, you get to enjoy it. My son eventually, when he, this game's kind of tame compared to M-rated games now, but eventually he's gonna play this game and he's gonna be able to enjoy it, and he doesn't even have to go back to a Switch, because I assure you, Capcom's gonna release this for the PS7, right, and the Xbox One, whatever the name is. So I'm glad that these games are being released in any state. I wish they put more effort, but I'm glad. But fans, going back to this fan project, one of the reasons these fans are, like you said, taking so much time, so much of their own free time to bring these games in kind of such a modern light and put all the effort, is because these games just have such a legacy, right? This game left a huge impact on people, myself included. I mean, what do you kind of feel playing the game, and that what was the biggest impact that you kind of sense while playing it, and with a modern lens?
I would say I'd like to say at least I'm decent at what they call putting myself in the mindset of it's okay. You can't, what's it called, not look at a game with a modern lens. But when I was playing it, you look at it and you're like, well, this is an older game. It's low resolution. But what struck me a lot was just, I guess, what struck me a lot around the beginning was just that there was a level of almost like higher amount of thinking that I didn't expect in a game that seemed kind of actiony, even though it was a survival horror. And it stuck with me the most because whenever it came to managing your ammo, exploration is greatly rewarding in that game. Or when you're just making it down a new area of the game where everything's dark and the rain is falling and the lightning is happening.
Yeah, that's great.
It strikes you. It never what they call, I never feel what they call snobby when it comes to older games. I know like a few people who it's so modern that you'll never see them even bother to try playing an older game because they really just prefer the higher fidelity of nowadays games. But
yeah,
I feel Resident Evil 4 is one of those games that not only can you actually play it and you know that it's an older game, but it really strikes you to know that they accomplished so much fidelity and detail and an incredibly smart gaming design in a title that I did not expect to have like nearly as much, being someone who's only played like very very small amounts of Resident Evil, and it's just it was very impressive. It struck me the most because it not only made me feel like I was improving as I was playing the game longer and longer.
And you know what? That's a good point. Shinji Mikami, I mean, this guy is brilliant, right? Like, you know, stuff like, I'm not sure if you were aware, but the game behind the scene adjusts the difficulty for you. So if you're dying a lot, then when the enemies die, they'll spawn more health items and more money and stuff like that. If you're doing really good, then you'll get less health items and less money. So the difficulty is always being kind of adjusted in the background, under the hood of sorts. So your experience with the game isn't frustrating, right? Like, so if you don't want to die a million, you know, yes, you're gonna die because it's a survivor horror kind of action game, but ultimately you're gonna be able to overcome the challenge regardless of the skill level, because the game is kind of holding your hand behind the background and saying, no, you're okay. Look, here's a bunch of herbs and stuff. Keep going. Yeah, you'll make it. And I think stuff like that is just brilliant. And you know, we haven't even really kind of gotten into one of his biggest legacies, which is the behind the camera third person view, which, you know, the creator of Gears of War has specifically said that was one of his biggest influence for Gears of War, right? One of the biggest series.
Which is a straight up, it's a straight up action title, and and it's a very different game. But it's amazing how some games are actually completely influenced by a game from a different genre, that because it did it so well, it actually spawns an entirely different type of game of its own.
Yeah, if you look at almost any third-person shooter, what does the camera do? I mean, I just played Control recently, and the camera gets behind your character either from the right side or the left side. You could switch either side, and that's a Resident Evil thing. You press the aim button on your gun, and the camera snaps behind, not necessarily behind you as center, but to the side to give you a viewing angle. Like, you know, your character isn't blocking your view, right? You could see you're almost like a first person of sorts, because your character is almost kind of fading to the side a little bit. It's kind of subtle, but it's just so brilliant, right? It's one of those things that it's hard to believe that wasn't really a standard in video games before it happened, but it wasn't, right? It's just so no-brainer.
Yeah, I would say that for me, the thing that was a little difficult to get used to, which I feel actually benefited the game. A lot of third-person shooters keep the camera these days quite a bit farther back.
You're right.
From your character. And don't get me wrong, it can change. It can depend on the type of game. The camera can be closer, it can be or it can be farther, depending on if it's like an action adventure platform.
I did notice that going back to it, yeah.
Yeah, but Resident Evil, what was interesting is the camera it'll shift every now and then when you're playing the game. The camera will back up when you're not aiming. Yeah. Like, it usually stays very close to the back of your character, and it actually causes what they call I wouldn't say it causes a minor blind spot that is completely rectified when you aim. And it helps, it benefits the game, because you are put in situations where things are very quiet and things are kind of looming around in the distance, and you have to, in the end, what's it called, take notice of your surroundings with that kind of thing. But it's amazing that actually sometimes they'd purposely pull the camera back in these sections just a little bit.
So I have a theory.
Wider view.
I have a theory about that. So when I went to play Resident Evil a couple months ago, Resident Evil 4, that is, I hadn't played it for a couple years, and then it did strike me how close the camera was, and it kind of got me thinking. Now one thing it could be, well, this is kind of one of, they were trailblazers, right? So, like anything, other games improve upon what you've done, but it also could have been because this is kind of like a survivor horror game, so less visibility, more the more tense you are because if you could see everything coming at you, then maybe it just takes away from the tension versus just kind of being really tight, and it makes and something could hit you where you don't see it, and also the probably for performance, right? So the closer the camera is, that means that less the GameCube has to display on screen. And already the GameCube's being pushed to its limit, so much so that they had to, put the black bars at the top and the bottom, make it letterbox, and that the only reason that game is letterbox is because, to ease up the pressure on the GameCube. Really, to me, that is the only reason that game is letterbox, to really kind of ease up performance on the GameCube. So, stuff like putting the camera closer, less geometry to render, and then also it had kind of the side effect of, well, holy crap, you didn't see that guy, you probably heard him calling you a little bitch from behind in Spanish, but you didn't see him coming. So,
And I feel in the end that while it was probably them trying it out or basically, you could basically say inventing it, for the first time in that type of mechanic, it's kind of funny because then there were a couple of games that even way after Resident Evil 4's release, decided to go back to that type of camera angle, especially the Resident Evil Revelations franchise, which actually pretty much mimic that angle, pretty much 100%. Resident Evil Revelations 1 and Resident Evil Revelations 2. And while despite the fact Resident Evil Revelations 2 allows you, I guess you could say, to probably move a little bit, the first Resident Evil Revelations does not. And I feel that it was a totally intentional thing, because it actually does cause, I would almost call it a slight, not incredibly, but a slight claustrophobic feel in tight spaces when a camera is that close to the back of you and you have to start aiming in this tight little knit spot, and you can feel almost like you're the person there witnessing the horrible thing that's about to try to get you, and you do not want it to get you. So
no, and that's a good point. Revelations 1 did kind of make a point to come back closer to Resident Evil 4, while its kind of big brothers were, trying to be, action stars, of sorts. So those games are pretty heavily influenced by Resident Evil 4. I mean, you could really just go down the list of modern games that are in some way, either directly or indirectly, influenced by Resident Evil 4 impact on the industry. I mean, these mechanics, when like Ocarina of Time with its Z targeting, Z targeting at that time was hugely influential. So much so that, after that, games just literally, they just came out with and were influenced by Ocarina of Time, and almost, a lot of third person games had this Z targeting feature, including famously Grand Theft Auto 3. That you could lock on to your character by holding the button and then shoot, and that was influenced by Zelda. Now, ironically, it kind of sucked. Grand Theft Auto 3, it wasn't. Zelda did it better, but then Resident Evil 4 behind the camera was that influential. Where when this game came out, then after that you could clearly see all these games just being influenced by it. And actually it has one up on Ocarina of Time, because Z targeting didn't really stick as much, right? Like, developers found better ways to do it, and this behind the camera Resident Evil influence is still going today, I think.
it is. In fact, we're talking like you can't count how many third-person games have been made with this whole thing in mind.
I mean,
and
Control.
it's
Control,
completely.
I just played one, Control. That's a perfect example, and that's a modern game, and it has, Resident Evil kind of influences all over it, right? Now you can move in Control, but still, same basic idea. It's just, this game is, it's just, its legacy is undeniable. But what I really kind of want to know, and I'll get out of the way because I'm really interested to know, is you again. I have those nostalgia goggles, right? I could talk about this game for another hour, but you didn't have those nostalgia goggles, right? So what not what would you say this game? How does it hold up now, right? So its influence, its legacy, but as a game without all this extra stuff, how does it just hold up as a game?
Well, as someone, as I said, who never got to play it at the time of its prime, around the beginning at all, I feel that a game like that, where I play it, I guess you'd say, is kind of a person from my standpoint to the more older standpoint, which, don't get me wrong, back then I played many games during the 2005 era. I do think it's a special game. So much so that when I look at the current course of Resident Evil now, which is, it's a very undecided course.
Yeah.
You have Resident Evil 7 went first person, Resident Evil 8's going first person. And I can tell Resident Evil 4 had a big impact on me because after I was done, I kept thinking to myself, like, why certain games didn't do this type of, like, smart gameplay more often, like that made you have to think a lot more within somehow an action-based survival horror segment.
It's a smart man's action game.
It very much is. And then the other part of me knows that it did have a big impact on me because as soon as I saw that Resident Evil 8 is going to be incorporating mechanics that from Resident Evil 4, like the inventory system, and then how I noticed how you've got this wide open vista area with village-like things. I mean, hell, think of what Resident Evil 8's called. It's called Village.
That's true.
Resident Evil 8 Village.
That's true. That's a very good point.
And you have all these, apparently there's going to be bigger enemies and creatures, and you're going to obviously have these demented type of villagers and kind of ghoulish like things, and some vampire like lady who lives in some type of castle in the middle of a village. And I'm just thinking to myself, like,
you know what, she's the female version of Bit Torres Mendes,
pretty much.
But wouldn't it be great if it turned out that she was the wife, right? You killed my husband, you bastard, right? It's your husband.
Well, actually, wouldn't it be funny if in the end she, Chris Redfield's going to be in here pretty prominently. They haven't really shown why he's there, but they keep making a big deal that, he's here with Ethan. But the thing that makes me actually kind of comic is if you're right about that, she might end up grabbing Chris by the throat and saying like, "Oh, you killed my husband," and he's like, "Oh no, that was Leon."
you got the wrong guy, I swear.
And so in the end, I feel like you can see that the inspiration is incredibly heavy. That after all these years, we're talking 15 years. Actually, if you really want to go to the release date of Village, we're talking almost 16 years now. 16 years later, and they're actually doing almost I wouldn't say a reverse, but while incorporating new mechanics and deciding to go first person, they decided, what if we took first person, which what we learned from Resident Evil 7, and we incorporated it with some of the greatest things that we learned from Resident Evil 4. And while you could almost say that they're copying a bit of a formula in regards to a village and a castle and some big entity, why then am I so excited for me to experience a game that is modern with all these elements for Resident Evil 4? And that's the one thing that I could say is because there's some games that have what they call timeless elements.
Yeah.
Those timeless elements vanish and people don't see them for a long time. People wonder, why can't we have that again? Now, and when you finally get it again, you realize you're onto something pretty great there.
Now, I do have to say that as great as this game is, right? I mean, this game's legendary, undeniable, one of the greatest games ever made. Mm-hmm. Part of its legacy has to be said that it kind of started the trend of bad Resident Evil games for Capcom, right? So they said, "Wow, this worked well. Let's take this, and dial it up to 11." And they came out with Resident Evil 5, which was okay, it was good, and then Resident Evil 6, which hopefully that's the last time I ever say that in our podcast, because there's nothing to be said. And it's just like, it's like a movie where you had a smart action movie, and then they try to make a franchise out of it, and they don't realize what made the movie great in the first place. They lose all the subtlety, and it becomes a parody of itself, and none of the. Oh, you know what? What's the perfect example? Terminator, right? Terminator 1 and 2.
Oh,
A
yes.
thinking man's action movie. It has all the action. I mean, it stands toe to
That's a
toe
perfect
with any
example.
action movie. But then,
Mhm.
it's a smart movie as well. And then you get the sequels, and they're just dumb, right? They're just dumb. Yeah, there's some popcorn moments in there, but they're dumb. And that's how I feel that the Resident Evil games have become before they kind of brought it back down to earth somewhat with Resident Evil 7, and yeah, there was some real kind of soul searching at Capcom. So that has to
Yeah,
be part of its legacy. Some of those games that came after the fact.
yeah, I do feel that actually it almost feels like it takes companies a while, and some companies don't even notice it, or they don't care to notice it. And I feel Capcom's one of those companies that it has so many great games and so many great franchises that at least for them, they've been very good at course correcting a lot of the time. It just unfortunately comes to companies, it takes forever.
That's true. That's true.
And I feel you can actually see the stages of it when, as you mentioned, you went from 4 to 5. And a lot of people rated 5 very well, but because they called it a good action game,
Which it was,
was
to
just,
be fair.
yeah, they
It
said it
was,
was a
yeah.
good action game.
Yeah.
But, they tried to mimic you've got the crazy villagers with the what they call virus that except meant to be creepy.
Yeah, I
And
mean, yeah, they did the whole kind of
they did, and they tried
Africa
to do,
theme, which was an interesting setting,
But the problem you end up getting when you take what they call a first time and you just try to mimic it with a different skin, and not to say that it exactly was a different skin, but if you think about it, right, you've got the very different setting of Resident Evil 4. You've got the Hispanic, the Spanish, or actually I'd call it more Spaniard setting.
Yeah.
And then you have the village and you have the castle, you have these weird things, and you find out it's a parasite, and it gets creepier and creepier as you get deeper and deeper into the game, which some of the stuff actually was sound design, was great of how it made it just so unnerving. But if you think about it, you basically take something that was really good first time, and if you're just trying to do something similar with a different skin, and saying, oh, we can make it an action heavy thing, you can kind of only maybe get away with it one time. Like, you can get away with it one time.
Well, they always have to beat themselves, right? They always have to outdo themselves. That's the thing. They always feel like they have to be better than the last one, right? Without really understanding what made the last one great.
Yeah, and I feel like 5 was at the moment where then they realized, oh, well, since we can't do that anymore, let's do something different, but let's keep that action setting. And that difference, I mean, I've seen scenes from Resident Evil 6. I've seen gameplay from 6.
It's ludicrous, man. You know what? Shame on me. I actually beat that game. I played it online with a friend. And, anytime you play...
said that's how it was only tolerable?
It was, yeah. Anytime you play anything online with a friend, it's only tolerable because you're playing with a friend. It's like watching a bad movie with a friend. You're laughing at it, but then you're crying inside because you'll never get your time back. And that's how I felt at the end of that game. Me and my friend looked at each other. It's like, wow, we really just did that, didn't we? And I'm sorry, it's just as bad as advertised, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But
I mean, unanimously, people can tell you that Resident Evil 6 was the feeling when people felt like Resident Evil base Resident Evil was declining.
I know this is going to sound silly, what I'm about to say, because I'm talking about a franchise that dealt with such kind of ludicrous, such, crazy oddball characters, and monsters, and it's just all,
if you really think about it, Resident Evil's always been cheesy. Always.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm what I'm about to say, I'm well aware that I'm talking about a franchise that that had, Oscar-worthy line like Jill Sandwich and Master of Unlocking and all that good stuff, right? And where they all go, bingo, right? But part 6 was when the series jumped the shark, right? that's literally where it jumped the shark, and it wasn't great. But quickly,
I think the biggest thing that made me laugh was probably the trying to save the plane.
Boy, yeah, but um, r- before we kind of wrap up, another thing that I want to say, kind of like as an old gamer and a huge fan of the original, style Resident Evil. I know everybody at the time was saying, "Hey, look, this is getting old and it's getting creaky, and the formula has to change." Much like Breath of the Wild is almost like the Resident Evil 4 of the Zelda series, because
That's true.
a lot of people were saying similar things about Zelda, but I'm still a huge fan of the old school Zelda gameplay, right?
Hmm.
Link to the Past and Link's Awakening, that stuff. I love it, man, and maybe Breath of the Wild is gonna do the same thing for Zelda that Resident Evil 4 did for Resident Evil, where that old style of gameplay might be just kind of changed altogether, because Capcom has not gone back, as far as I remember, really to the old school Resident Evil formula. I mean, yeah, well, Resident Evil 7 definitely had a similar structure, but old Resident Evil fans really know that it's not really the same, right? Like, and you're playing it right now with Resident Evil HD. Being stuck in a mansion or police station, and all the doors are locked, and you're almost unraveled. You're pulling on a thread, and you're unraveling everything. Doors are opening, and more areas are being available to you. Like, I miss that style, and I sure hope that it's not gone.
Yeah, and I would say that I do think that there are certain, I guess, say, gameplay mechanics that maybe people feel are kind of like what they call of the time.
Boxes,
And I
bring
know
back boxes.
and I feel like I think there's actually, as far as I know, some games that have tried to emulate the very first Resident Evil games, to not very good success. But I do feel that we're on that road now where Resident Evil has changed significantly. And the best I can kind of think about it is, if you take a lot of the learning from the beginning and from probably the middle of what made it, all those sections that made it great. If you take all those great mechanics and the feelings and the memories and you incorporate it into what we have today, I think we'll always have something that's probably successful. And you mentioned the Breath of the Wild thing, and I felt that was interesting because Eiji Aonuma, the producer of the entire Legend of Zelda franchise, mentioned that because ever since Skyward Sword, he felt they were starting to hit that point of kind of
Yeah.
doubling down on that formula a lot. They were trying to change it up, but he felt that if they were really going to change things up, they needed to go back to the basics. And the basics, and sometimes going back to the basics, spawns a new type of gameplay that not only changes the direction of the franchise, but also reinvigorates an older feeling of mechanics that are changed. And I get the feeling that that's what possibly Resident Evil 8 is, because Resident Evil 4 made such an impact that when you really think about it, when you look back and you see what worked well, you were able to then make a game with a new feeling, a new type of way of handling things, yet with that intelligence and that tension and that type of storytelling that Capcom loves to tell with their nice engine now. I kind of feel like if Resident Evil 8 is as what I think it's going to be, then in my opinion, you could say Resident Evil 8 is going to be kind of almost like a beautiful legacy
Yeah.
of Resident Evil 4.
And I gotta say, there's probably somebody there's gonna be somebody kind of screaming, but what about the Resident Evil 2 remake or the Resident Evil 3 remake, right? Isn't that your classic Resident Evil that you're kind of crying about? Well, not really, no. They're not. I mean, that they have, they use the classic games as kind of like the basis for it, but they're not really classic, Resident Evil. Not the tank controls really kind of, unraveling the mansion or whatever. They're not quite like it, right? They're amazing games in their own right, but they're not quite classic Resident Evil. So hopefully Revelations showed that you could do mainline games like these big budget Resident Evil games, but then you could also release this kind of digital Resident Evil games and still be successful. So hopefully Capcom and Nintendo could use kind of the digital releases to go back to the classic gameplay while using the mainline series to experiment and move the series forward mechanically and where they need to, right? So hopefully there's room for both.
Yeah, I'd say in the end, I would say there's always room for both because everyone knows that everyone loves nostalgia, and the longer and longer time goes on, there's always ways that people think that they need to kind of reinvigorate what once was, because you don't want to 100% lose that old type of formula, just for the reason that it was a huge thing to a lot of people that care about these games.
All right, so before we go, Joseph, I want you to say your favorite Resident Evil line, but in the best, impersonation that you could do. Do the best impression.
That's kind of difficult, though. Hold on. I'm trying to remember. It was I'm trying to remember. It is a line Leon Kennedy says. I just don't remember to who it was, but it was one of the few lines I think where he sounded pretty competent. Oh wait, I think it's when he threw the knife at Salazar. I forget if he said, "Why don't you stick around?"
What? Yeah. That was pretty cheesy. Yeah,
it was really cheesy, but it worked so well just because of the face that was animated on Salazar's face when he realized in the middle of his long trolling rant that he kept doing throughout the game. He did it so much that when Leon finally threw the knife in his hand, his face of terror was hilarious.
Yeah.
It was, and Leon just saying like, "Why don't you stick around then?" It was cheesy. It's been done before, but it was so satisfying.
One of my favorite lines is when Ashley, after they just escape, they almost certain doom, and they barely escape the cave on the jet ski, and they're stuck in the middle of God knows where. I mean, yeah, they might have survived the whole ordeal, but God knows where they are. God knows if they're going to get rescued. And they got big problems on their hand, right? I think I even saw sharks starting to circle them. And you know what's on her mind? Hey, you want to do some overtime at my place, right? Yeah, right? That's what's on her mind. Not the rescue, not anything else, right?
And and just when you think he's being professional, he tells her, "Sorry, Ma, I can't do that and everything, and he turns her down, and she says, "Oh, gotta try." Just to think when I thought that he was like, "Oh, look at him being the professional, reluctant hero who's only got slight little feelings for Ada." Just when I think that, the game ends only for a little thing to pop up where he's talking to Hannigan, who has been forever.
Hannigan, is that you?
Finally, the line's jack free.
Hey, Hannigan, no glasses.
Forget the glasses. What's the status of the mission?
I've rescued the subject. We're returning home.
You did it, Leon.
Thanks. You're kind of cute without those glasses. Give me your number when I get back.
May I remind you that you're still on duty?
Story of my life.
Singing is really Leon. After all this, and I thought, when you think about it, it makes complete sense.
What they should have done is like the end of the Fifth Element. Spoilers coming up on the end of the Fifth Element. So if anybody wants to turn it off now, when they go check and they're like, "Oh shit, Bruce Willis has gained it on with the girl that's the Fifth Element," right? It would be great if they go back home and the president's like, "Where's my lovely daughter? I want to see my daughter, right? I want to give her a hug. I thought, she got kidnapped and she must have gone through hell. Sorry, sir. She's kind of busy right now." And then they cut to Leon and Ashley. That would have been the perfect ending, really.
Yeah, after he turned it down and they realized, he didn't really turn it down.
Well, I mean, after Hannigan, he could only take so much rejection that he's like, "Fine, Ashley, fine, right? Bring the come over with the Secret Service and have them wait outside." And it's,
all I'm thinking about is in the end, if you think about it, he literally basically went in alone, aside from maybe a little help from Ada Wong, and single-handedly basically took down an entire, how you call it, mini nation of like messed up parasitic villagers and a
Yeah.
tyrannical cult. Like literally just went in there and did that.
Yeah,
So, and let's not forget, I forget his name.
well, think about it.
I think his name was Jack. Let's not forget the helicopter pilot.
Oh yeah, a moment of silence for the helicopter. I mean,
Yes.
he went out.
He was good. He
yeah.
was good while he lasted.
No, he went out like a boss. Let me tell you, right?
He did. Yeah.
What's interesting though is if they kidnapped the president's daughter right now, then we'd probably be going to war with another third world country or something like that, right? But no, not in the Resident Evil world. Send in one man. Get me Leon's number, right? So this game is something else, and I'm glad we got a chance to talk about it. It's one of my favorite of all times. I'm glad that you were able to experience it, and it's just anybody out there who hasn't got a chance really should play this game, and God knows it is on everything, right? Even a toaster probably at this moment, your
it's like pick one.
Yeah,
pick
yeah,
one. If
yeah.
You can the Wii one, but just pick one.
You can't walk around your house without stumbling into a port of Resident Evil 4. But it's one of my favorite. I'm glad we talked about it. I love it, and that's it for me, really. And if you enjoyed this episode, then we're gonna do a lot more episodes like this where we take deep dives into our favorite series, topics, maybe movies, TV shows, anything that really kind of interests our interest, and we're gonna take deep dives, and hopefully you guys want to hear it, and hopefully it's interesting, and we'll do our homework, and really it's kind of water cooler talk, but kind of sitting down with your buddies around the table and kicking the can. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode on one of the greatest action games ever made. We hope to see you next week.
You can find us currently on Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. If you enjoy our ramblings, please feel free to subscribe, rate us, or leave a voice message so we can hear your spec of today's topics. If you want more retro hits and modern bits, just hop on back. You have a good one.
Bye, everybody.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?